Margaret stood in her kitchen at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at the phone on the wall. It hadn't rung in 3 days. But that wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was the feeling in her chest, a tightness that told her something was different this time. Something had changed. She just didn't know what yet. The phone was avocado-green and installed in 1974, the same year she and Robert bought this house. 49 years it had hung there, a witness to every call, good news, bad news, and everything in between. She remembered the night her daughter called to say she was engaged. The morning her son phoned from college, homesick and crying. In the afternoon the hospital called about Robert's heart attack. That phone had been the messenger of her entire adult life. And now, it was silent. Margaret ran her finger along the rotary dial, feeling each number's worn groove. Her arthritis made her hands shake slightly, but she could still dial if she needed to. The question was, who would she call? Her address book sat in the drawer below, filled with names. But when she'd opened it last week, she'd been startled to realize how many of those names belonged to people who were gone. Eleanor, dead 5 years. Patricia, gone last spring. Her cousin Jerome passed away in his sleep 2 winters ago. The pages were becoming a memorial. She walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood. The Hendersons' house across the street sat empty. They'd moved to Florida to be near their grandchildren. The Kramers next door had sold it to a young couple who worked long hours and barely waved. The old neighborhood was disappearing, replaced by something she no longer recognized. It had been 6 months since Robert died. 6 months of learning to sleep alone, cook for one, and make decisions without turning to ask his opinion. Everyone said it would get easier. They said the first year was the hardest, that time would heal, and that she'd adjust. But what nobody mentioned was the silence. The suffocating, endless silence that filled every room of this house like water rising in a sinking ship. The phone used to ring at least twice a day. Robert's brother checking in. Her daughter Sarah called during her commute. Her son David with updates about the grandchildren. Her friend Lise invited her to church socials or book club. But something had shifted after the funeral. At first, the calls came frequently, casseroles delivered, offers of help, invitations to lunch. Margaret had declined most of them. She wasn't ready. She needed time to grieve, to process, to just be alone with her memories. "Give me a few weeks," she'd said. "I'll call you when I'm ready." But weeks became months. And somewhere in that time, people stopped calling. Not all at once. Gradually. The way snow melts, you don't notice it happening until suddenly the ground is bare, and you can't remember when you last saw white. Now Margaret stood by that green phone, realizing with cold clarity that she had waited too long. She had pushed people away when they reached out, and now they'd stopped reaching. The silence she'd wanted had become the loneliness she feared. She picked up the receiver and held it to her ear, listening to the dial tone. That steady hum was somehow comforting, proof the phone still worked, that the connection to the outside world was still there if she chose to use it. She set it back down gently, as if it might break. On the refrigerator hung a calendar. Sarah's birthday was circled in red, 3 weeks away. Margaret had always called her children on their birthdays at the exact minute they were born. Sarah at 3:14 a.m. David at 9:22 p.m. She'd maintained that tradition for 43 years. But this year, for the first time, she wondered if Sarah expected the call. Or if Sarah had given up expecting things from her. The mantel clock chimed 7. Margaret hadn't eaten dinner. She wasn't particularly hungry these days. Food tasted different when you ate alone, bland, purposeless, just fuel. She opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents. A carton of milk. Some leftover soup. Half a loaf of bread. The refrigerator of someone who'd stopped trying. She closed it and walked to the living room, where Robert's chair sat empty. She'd kept his reading glasses on the side table, his bookmarks still holding his place in a mystery novel he'd never finish. The home health aide had suggested she might want to pack up his things and make the space her own. But Margaret couldn't. Not yet. Maybe never. The television remote sat on the coffee table. She could turn it on and let the noise fill the silence. But television felt like giving up somehow, like admitting she had nothing better to do than watch other people's lives unfold on a screen. Instead, she went to the closet and pulled down a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Letters from Robert during his deployment in Vietnam. Letters from her mother when Margaret moved away after college. Letters from Sarah and David at summer camp, filled with misspellings and stick figure drawings. Letters from friends, relatives, and people whose faces she could barely remember now. She carried the box to the kitchen table and began reading. Robert's letters first. His handwriting, messy but passionate, the words of a 23-year-old boy scared and in love. "Dearest Maggie," one began. "It's been 37 days since I held you. I've counted every single one." She traced his words with her finger, remembering the girl who'd received this letter. 21 years old, working at the library, living with her parents, and checking the mail 3 times a day. That girl had been so afraid Robert wouldn't come home, afraid their life together would never begin. But he did come home. And they had 47 years. 47 years of ordinary, beautiful, complicated life. So why did she feel cheated? Why did 47 years feel like it wasn't enough? She pulled out a letter from Sarah, written when she was 8. "Dear Mommy, camp is fun, but I miss you. The food is yucky. Love, Sarah. P.S. I drew you a butterfly." The drawing was still there, faded but visible, a purple butterfly with uneven wings. Margaret felt tears building. When had Sarah stopped drawing her butterflies? When did phone calls replace letters? When had her children's lives become so busy that checking in felt like a chore rather than a joy? She pulled out her daughter's last letter, not from childhood, but from 10 years ago. Sarah had written it after a fight they'd had about something Margaret couldn't even remember now. "Mom, I know we don't always see eye to eye, but I want you to know I love you. Even when we disagree. Even when we frustrate each other. You're my mother, and that means everything." Margaret hadn't remembered this letter existed. She must have tucked it away and forgotten. Now it felt like a message from the past, from a version of their relationship that felt simpler and warmer. What had happened between then and now? The clock showed 8:15 p.m. In the old days, this was when Robert would make them tea. He'd put the kettle on, and they'd sit at this table and talk about their days, his garden progress, her book club discussion, and what they'd heard from the kids. Small talk mostly. The kind of conversation that feels meaningless until it's gone, and then you'd give anything to have it back. Margaret stood and put the kettle on herself. Her hands shook as she filled it, not just from arthritis now, but from something else. Emotion. Fear. Regret. She couldn't quite name it. As the water heated, she looked at the phone again. She could call Sarah right now. Or David. Or Louise. She could pick up that receiver and dial, and someone would answer. Probably. Unless they were busy. Unless they saw her name and decided to call back later. Unless they'd moved on and didn't have room in their lives anymore for an old woman who'd pushed them away. That was the fear, wasn't it? Not that no one would answer. But they would answer, and she'd hear it in their voice. The obligation. The weariness. The sense that calling her back was one more item on a to-do list. The kettle whistled. Margaret poured water over a tea bag and watched it steep, the water turning amber. She carried the cup back to the table and sat down, the steam rising in front of her face. She thought about her mother. Dead now 23 years. Margaret remembered visiting her in the nursing home during those final months. Her mother had been so lonely, waiting for visits that came less and less frequently as Margaret's life got busy, kids to raise, jobs to work, a house to maintain. Margaret had promised herself she'd visit more. Next week. Next month. When things calmed down. But things never calmed down. And then her mother was gone. And Margaret was left with guilt that felt like a stone in her chest. Was Sarah feeling that same guilt now? Had Margaret become her mother? The obligation, the burden, the person you meant to call but never quite found the time. Margaret opened her address book, the one from the drawer. She ran her finger down the names. Louise Chapman, her best friend since 1981. They'd met at a PTA meeting and bonded over terrible coffee and worse fundraising ideas. For 30 years, they'd talked at least twice a week. They'd traveled together after Robert and Louise's husband, Frank, retired. They'd nursed each other through illnesses, celebrated grandchildren's births, and mourned losses. But Margaret hadn't called Louise since the funeral. Louise had called her many times. Left messages. Just checking in, dear. Call me when you're ready. But Margaret never felt ready. And eventually, the messages stopped. She picked up the phone and dialed Louise's number from memory. Her heart pounded as it rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Hello? Louise's voice, older than Margaret remembered but still warm. Louise, it's Margaret. A pause. Not long, but noticeable. Margaret. My goodness. How are you, dear? I'm sorry I haven't called. Oh, don't apologize. I know you've been going through a difficult time. They were being polite. Careful. This wasn't how they used to talk. They used to interrupt each other, laugh at inside jokes, speak in shorthand developed over decades. Now they sounded like acquaintances making small talk. I was hoping, Margaret said, her voice shakier than she wanted, that maybe we could have lunch this week? Like we used to? Another pause. This week is tough, actually. My daughter's visiting from Portland, and we've got plans every day. But maybe next month? Next month. The same thing Margaret had said 6 months ago. Give me a few weeks. I'll call you when I'm ready. Of course, Margaret said. Next month sounds lovely. They talked for another minute, surface level, exchanging basic updates. Louise's grandson started college. Margaret's garden needed weeding. Then they said goodbye, and Margaret hung up feeling more alone than before she'd called. She sat at the table until her tea went cold. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. She thought about calling Sarah or David, but what would she say? I'm lonely and feel pathetic. I miss you felt manipulative. I made a mistake pushing everyone away. I felt too vulnerable, too raw. So she sat in silence, surrounded by letters from people who'd once loved her, might still love her, but had learned to live without her response. The truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. She hadn't just lost Robert. She'd lost something bigger. She'd lost her place in other people's lives. When you pull away from the world adjusts. It closes the gap where you used to stand. And coming back isn't as simple as just showing up again. You have to earn your way back in. Margaret looked at the calendar again. Sarah's birthday. 3 weeks away. She could call at 3:14 a.m. like always. But would Sarah want to be woken up? Would she be annoyed? Would she wonder why her mother, who'd been absent and distant for 6 months, suddenly expected her to maintain old traditions? Or worse, would Sarah expect the call, and when it came, would it feel hollow? An empty gesture from a mother who'd been physically present but emotionally absent. Margaret stood and walked to the bedroom. She got ready for bed mechanically, washing her face, brushing her teeth, and changing into her nightgown. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. When had she gotten so old? When had her eyes gotten so tired? She climbed into bed, into the same spot she'd slept in for 49 years. Robert's side was still made up, undisturbed. She'd been sleeping on the very edge of her side, as if he might come back and need his space. Sleep wouldn't come. Margaret lay in the darkness, listening to the house. The refrigerator hummed. The heating system clicked on. A car passed outside. Ordinary sounds that felt amplified in the loneliness. At 2:47 a.m., she got up. She walked back to the kitchen, turned on the light, and looked at the phone one more time. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened the drawer beneath it, and pulled out a notepad and pen. She sat down and began to write. Dear Sarah, the letter began. I've been trying to find the right time to call you, but I'm starting to realize there is no right time. So I'm writing instead, because I need to say things I don't know how to say out loud. Her hand moved across the page, the words flowing easier than she expected. I want to apologize for disappearing these past 6 months. For being so wrapped up in my own grief that I couldn't see you were grieving too. You lost your father, and instead of being there for you, I made you worry about me. I made you wonder if you were doing enough, calling enough, and checking in enough. And you were. You were more than enough. It was me who wasn't there. She paused, her eyes filling with tears that finally spilled over. I think I was afraid, she wrote. Afraid that if I let myself need people, I'd be a burden. Afraid that if I showed how much I was hurting, I'd make everyone else hurt more. Afraid that if I leaned on you, you'd realize how weak I really am. But pushing everyone away didn't make me strong. It just made me alone. Your father used to tell me I was stubborn. He'd say it with a smile, like it was one of my charming qualities. But stubbornness isn't always charming. Sometimes it's just pride in wearing a different name. I was too proud to admit I needed help. Too proud to accept casseroles and condolence calls. Too proud to say the simple truth, I'm scared and sad, and I don't know how to do this without him. Margaret's tears were flowing freely now, dropping onto the paper and smudging the ink. She didn't wipe them away. I keep waiting for things to feel normal again, but I'm starting to understand that normal is gone. There's no going back to how things were. There's only forward, to something new, something I haven't figured out yet. And I don't want to figure it out alone. I want you in my life. I want David in my life. I want my grandchildren to know me as more than the sad old woman at holiday dinners. I want to be present, not just physically there. She took a breath and continued. I know I can't undo these past 6 months. I know I've created distance, and I know trust and connection don't heal overnight. But I'm hoping we can start again. Not from where we left off, but from where we are now. I'm hoping you'll be patient with me while I learn how to do this. How to be your mother in this new chapter of my life, this chapter without your father. I'm writing this at 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, because the silence in this house has become deafening, because I realized that the phone hasn't rung in 3 days, and it's my own fault. I trained people not to call. I trained them that I wouldn't answer, that I needed space, and that I'd reach out when I was ready. But here's what I've learned, you're never ready. You just have to do it anyway. Margaret signed the letter and put it in an envelope. She addressed it to Sarah, sealed it, and placed a stamp in the corner. Then she started another letter, this one to David. Dear David, she wrote. Your sister is getting a letter too, but I wanted to write to you separately because you and I have always had our own language, haven't we? You were my quiet child, the one who felt things deeply but didn't always have words for them. I see now that I do the same thing. She wrote about his father, about memories David might not remember, how Robert had paced the hospital hallway the night David was born, too nervous to sit down. How Robert had taught David to ride a bike in their driveway, running alongside for hours until David found his balance. How proud Robert had been at David's wedding, even though he'd cried through the whole ceremony. He was so proud of the man you became, Margaret wrote. And so am I. I'm sorry if I haven't said that enough lately. I'm sorry if my grief made you feel like you had to tiptoe around me, like you couldn't share your life because I was too fragile to hear about happiness. She signed that letter too, sealed it, and stamped it. Then she wrote to Louise, and to her neighbor Carol, who'd brought over soup 3 times before Margaret stopped answering the door. And to Robert's brother Jim, who'd called every Sunday until Margaret let the calls go to voicemail. One letter after another, her hand cramping but not stopping. By the time the sun began to rise, Margaret had written 7 letters. Her hand ached, her eyes burned from crying, and she felt exhausted in a way that was somehow cleansing. She stacked the letters in a neat pile on the kitchen table and looked at the phone one more time. It still hadn't rung. But somehow, that felt different now. The silence didn't feel quite so suffocating. Because she'd filled it with something, with words, with honesty, with the first steps toward reconnection. Margaret made coffee as the morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains. Real coffee, not the instant kind she'd been settling for. She measured the grounds carefully, filled the pot with water, and listened to it percolate. The sound reminded her of Sunday mornings with Robert, pancakes on the griddle, newspapers spread across the table, and the lazy comfort of having nowhere to be. She carried her cup to the front porch and sat in the wicker chair that needed new cushions. The neighborhood was waking up. Mr. Patterson jogged past with his dog. The young couple next door loaded their car for work. A mail truck turned onto the street, making its early rounds. Margaret thought about the letters sitting on her kitchen table. She could mail them today. Walk to the corner mailbox and drop them in. The simple act felt monumental, like stepping off a cliff, not knowing if she'd fall or fly. But there was something else she needed to do first. Something that scared her even more than the letters. She went back inside, picked up the phone, and before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed Sarah's number. It was 6:53 a.m. Early, but Sarah would be up. She'd always been a morning person, even as a child. The phone rang. Once. Twice. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was surprised. "Is everything okay?" That was what Margaret had become, someone whose calls meant emergency, not just connection. "Everything's fine," Margaret said quickly. "I know it's early. I wanted to hear your voice." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Margaret could hear movement in the background, the clink of dishes, water running. Her daughter makes breakfast and lives her life. "I'm glad you called," Sarah said finally, and her voice was softer now, careful. "I've been worried about you." "I know. I'm sorry." "You don't have to apologize, Mom." "Yes, I do." Margaret's throat tightened. "I do have to apologize. I disappeared on you. On everyone. Your dad died, and I acted like I was the only one who lost him. But you lost your father. David lost his father. And instead of being there for you, I made you take care of me. Mom, please let me say this." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "I thought I needed space to grieve. I thought being alone would help me process everything. But all it did was make me more alone. And now I'm standing in this empty house, and the phone hasn't rung in 3 days, and I realized it's because I taught everyone not to call. I taught you that I didn't want to be bothered. And I'm so sorry." She heard Sarah's breath catch. "Mom, I didn't know you felt that way. I thought you were doing okay. You said you needed time?" "I did need time. But I took too much of it. And now I don't know how to come back." "You just did," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "You just came back by calling me." Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I wrote you a letter. Last night. I couldn't sleep, so I sat at the kitchen table and wrote you a letter. A real letter, with a pen and paper. Like we used to write when you were at camp." "You did?" Sarah's voice lifted with something Margaret hadn't heard in months. Genuine warmth, surprise, maybe even joy. "I did. And I wrote David one too. And Louise. And several other people I'd been too stubborn and scared to reach out to." "What did the letters say?" Margaret looked at the stack on the table. "The truth. That I'm lonely. That I'm scared. That I don't know how to be a widow, but I know I don't want to be one alone. That I miss you. That I'm sorry. That I love you." Sarah was crying now. Margaret could hear it. "Mom, I love you too. I've always loved you. Even when you didn't answer my calls. Even when you canceled plans. I understood, or I tried to understand. But I miss you. I miss my mom." "I'm here now," Margaret said. "I mean, I know I'm not there with you, but I'm here. I'm showing up. Or I'm trying to learn how. That's all I ever wanted, Mom. Just for you to show up." They talked for 20 minutes. Really talked. Sarah told her about work stress Margaret didn't know about her youngest daughter struggling with algebra, and about the leak in their basement they'd been dealing with. Normal life things. Problems and updates and the mundane details that make up a relationship. And Margaret listened. Really listened. Not just waiting for her turn to talk, not thinking about what to say next. She listened like she was starving for information about her daughter's life, because she was. "Mom," Sarah said, "eventually, my birthday is in 3 weeks. I know. October 23rd. 3:14 in the morning. Sarah laughed. That sound Margaret had been missing without realizing how much. You still remember the exact time. I remember everything about that day. The hospital smell. How scared I was. How your father held my hand so tight I thought he'd break it. How, when the nurse put you in my arms, you looked right at me like you already knew me. Are you going to call me? At 3:14? Margaret heard the hope in her daughter's voice, the tentative question underneath. Do you want me to? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Yes, I want you to. I've missed that call the last few months. You always called, every year, right on time. And this year I wasn't sure if. I didn't know if you'd feel up to it. I'll call, Margaret promised. But Sarah? I want to do more than that. I want to be involved again. I want to know about Emma's algebra struggles. I want to hear about your basement leak. I want to be the kind of mother and grandmother who shows up. Not just for birthdays and holidays, but for regular life. I'd like that, Sarah said quietly. We'd all like that. After they hung up, Margaret sat with the phone in her lap, feeling lighter than she had in months. The house didn't seem quite as empty. The silence didn't press in quite as hard. She picked up the letters and looked at them. She'd written them in the middle of the night, in a moment of raw honesty. Reading them now in daylight, she worried they were too much, too emotional, too vulnerable. But maybe that was okay. Maybe being too much was better than being absent. Margaret got dressed, not in the sweatpants she'd been living in, but in real clothes. A blouse Robert had always liked. Her good slacks. She even put on lipstick, something she hadn't done since the funeral. She gathered the letters, grabbed her purse, and walked to the mailbox on the corner. It was a beautiful autumn morning. Leaves crunched under her feet. The air had that crisp quality that made everything feel possible. At the mailbox, she hesitated. Once she dropped these letters in, she couldn't take them back. People would read her words. They'd know how lonely she'd been, how much she'd struggled, and how desperately she wanted connection. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't honesty the only way forward? She opened the mailbox slot and dropped the letters in, one by one. The metal door clanged shut with a finality that felt both terrifying and freeing. On the walk back, her neighbor Carol was checking her mailbox. She looked up and saw Margaret, and something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe caution. Margaret, Carol said. How are you? The old Margaret would have said fine and kept walking. But the new Margaret, or maybe the real Margaret, the one who'd been hiding, stopped. I've been better, Margaret said honestly. I've been struggling, actually. But I'm trying to do better. And Carol, I want to apologize. You brought me soup 3 different times, and I never even properly thanked you. I was so wrapped up in my own grief that I couldn't see other people's kindness. I'm sorry. Carol's expression softened. Oh, honey. You don't need to apologize. I knew you were hurting. That doesn't excuse rudeness. You reached out, and I shut you down. But I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to let people in. Carol smiled, and it was warm and genuine. That takes courage. Real courage. She paused, then said, I'm making chili tonight? Way too much for just me and Stan. Would you like to come over for dinner? Nothing fancy. Just us at the kitchen table. The old Margaret would have made an excuse. Would have said she had plans or wasn't feeling well or needed to stay home. But that Margaret had been alone for 6 months, and where had that gotten her? I'd love to, Margaret said. What time? 6:30? I'll be there. Margaret walked back to her house with something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize the feeling. It was hope. Inside, she looked at the phone again. It still hadn't rung, but somehow that felt okay. Because she'd made calls. She'd written letters. She'd accepted an invitation. She was building bridges instead of waiting for someone else to cross the gap. She spent the day cleaning the house, really cleaning, not just surface tidying. She opened the windows to let fresh air in. She vacuumed. She dusted. She even went into the bedroom and smoothed the covers on Robert's side of the bed. It felt like a small surrender, an acknowledgement that he wasn't coming back to sleep there. But it also felt like making space for something new, even if she didn't know what that was yet. At 3 o'clock, the phone rang. Margaret jumped at the sound, her heart racing. She'd gotten so used to silence that the ring felt almost violent, intrusive. She picked up on the third ring. "Hello? Mom? It's David." Her son. Calling in the middle of the afternoon. "David. Hi, sweetheart. Sarah called me," he said. "She told me you two talked this morning." Margaret's stomach dropped. Had she said something wrong? Had Sarah called David to complain? "She said you sounded good," David continued. "Better than you've sounded in a while. And she said you wrote letters?" "I did. Yours should arrive in a few days." "I don't need to wait for a letter, Mom. I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to tell you I'm glad you're reaching out. I've been worried about you. Everyone keeps saying that. That they've been worried. Because we love you," David said simply. "Dad died, and we didn't want to lose you too. But it felt like we were losing you anyway, just in a different way." The truth of his words hit Margaret hard. She'd been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't considered how her withdrawal affected others. They'd been grieving too, not just for Robert, but for her, for the mother who'd disappeared behind walls of grief. "I'm sorry," she said. "I keep saying that today. I'm sorry. But I mean it. I was selfish." "You weren't selfish, Mom. You were hurting. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm standing, I hurt people because I was hurting. That feels selfish." David was quiet for a moment. "You know what Dad used to tell me? When I was a kid and I'd mess up? He'd say, you can't change what you did, but you can change what you do next. You can't undo the last 6 months, but you can change what happens from here forward. And it sounds like that's what you're doing." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. How many times could a person cry in one day? "He said that to you?" "All the time. Usually after I broke something or got in trouble at school. He was good at perspective. Helping me see that mistakes weren't the end of the world. He was good at a lot of things," Margaret said softly. "He was. But so are you, Mom. You're good at a lot of things too. You just forgot for a while." They talked for another half hour. David told her about his job. He was up for a promotion he hadn't mentioned because he didn't want to burden her with good news while she was grieving. His teenage son had made the soccer team. His daughter was learning piano. Life had been happening while Margaret hid in her grief. Birthdays and achievements and ordinary miracles. And she missed it because she was too busy missing Robert. After they hung up, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and cried. But this time, the tears felt different. Not helpless or hopeless. Just honest. She was sad. She missed her husband. She regretted the time she'd lost. But underneath all that, there was something else. Gratitude. For her children who still loved her despite her absence. For neighbors who still invited her to dinner. For friends who wrote letters she hadn't answered yet but would soon. At 6:25, Margaret walked across the street to Carol and Stan's house. She'd brought a bottle of wine, not expensive, just something from her pantry that Robert had been saving for a special occasion. She'd realized that if you waited for special occasions, you'd never open any bottles. Carol answered the door with a smile. "Margaret. Come in, come in." The house smelled like chili and cornbread. Stan was setting the table, and he looked up when Margaret entered. "Margaret. Good to see you out and about." They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the three of them, and talked about everything and nothing. Stan's retirement plans, Carol's book club drama, the neighborhood gossip Margaret had missed. They asked about her kids, and she told them, really told them, with details and pride. "Sarah's oldest is applying to colleges," Margaret said. "Can you believe it? It feels like yesterday she was learning to walk." "Time's funny like that," Carol said. "Slow when you're in it, fast when you look back." After dinner, Stan put on coffee, and Carol brought out a peach pie. They moved to the living room, and Margaret found herself laughing, actually laughing, at Stan's story about trying to fix their garbage disposal. "I'm standing there with my hand in the sink," Stan said, "and Carol's yelling at me that I'm going to electrocute myself, and I'm saying, it's not even plugged in. But she's not listening." "Because you never know," Carol interrupted. "That's how people get hurt. They assume things aren't plugged in. It wasn't plugged in. That time." Margaret laughed so hard her sides hurt. When was the last time she'd laughed like this? When was the last time she'd felt light? Around 9 o'clock, Margaret stood to leave. Carol walked her to the door. "Thank you," Margaret said. "For inviting me. For not giving up on me." "We're neighbors," Carol said. "That's what neighbors do." "Still. I know I wasn't easy to deal with. I shut everyone out." Carol took Margaret's hand. "You know what I learned when my mother died? Grief makes you do things that don't make sense to anyone else. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're really just hiding. And the scary part is coming out of hiding, because you don't know if people will still be there. Are they? Still there?" "Most of them," Carol said honestly. "Some people drift away. That's life. But the ones who matter? They wait. Not forever, maybe. But they wait long enough." Margaret walked back across the street, Carol's words echoing in her mind. The ones who matter wait. Sarah had waited. David had waited. Louise was waiting, even if she was cautious now. The world hadn't ended while Margaret grieved. It had just paused. And now it was starting to move again. Back in her kitchen, Margaret looked at the phone. Still no calls since David's that afternoon. But she wasn't waiting for calls anymore. She was making them. She was writing letters. She was accepting invitations. She was showing up. She went to bed that night and slept better than she had in months. No dreams of Robert dying. No nightmares about being alone. Just deep, quiet sleep. The next morning, Margaret called Louise again. This time, Louise answered on the first ring. "Margaret. Twice in 2 days. This is a nice surprise. I know you said this week is busy with your daughter visiting, but I was wondering, maybe the three of us could have coffee? Just an hour. I'd love to meet her, hear about Portland, and catch up properly." Louise hesitated, and Margaret braced herself for another polite rejection. But then Louise said, "Actually, that would be lovely. Jennifer's been wanting to meet my famous friends. How about tomorrow morning? 10 o'clock at the Coffee Bean? I'll be there." Margaret spent the rest of the day doing something she hadn't done in years. She went through Robert's things. Not to get rid of them, not yet. But to sort through them. To remember. She pulled out his favorite sweater, the one that still smelled faintly like him. She held it to her face and let herself cry, but it was a different kind of crying. Gentler. Less desperate. She found his wallet in the nightstand drawer. Inside was a picture of her from their wedding day. She was 23, laughing at something the photographer had said. Robert had carried this picture for 47 years. Through Vietnam. Through job changes and house moves and everything else. This picture of her, young and happy, had been with him every day. She sat on the bed and looked at that photo for a long time. That girl had no idea what was coming, the struggles and joys, the children and grandchildren, the ordinary beautiful life that awaited her. If Margaret could go back and tell that girl anything, what would she say? "It's worth it," Margaret whispered to the photo. "All of it. Even the hard parts. Even the end. It's all worth it." The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Coffee Bean 10 minutes early. She ordered tea and sat at a corner table, watching the door. When Louise walked in with a woman who had to be her daughter, Margaret stood up, her heart pounding. Louise smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Margaret." She hugged her, and Margaret held on perhaps a moment too long. "And this is Jennifer," Louise said, stepping back. Jennifer had Louise's eyes. She shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Mom's told me so much about you. I feel like I already know you." They settled into conversation easier than Margaret expected. Jennifer talked about Portland, about her job and marketing, and about her teenage sons. Louise added details and commentary. And Margaret listened, asked questions, and contributed stories of her own. "Mom said you lost your husband earlier this year," Jennifer said gently. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you." "It's been an adjustment." "I can't imagine," Jennifer said. "Mom and Dad were married 48 years when he passed. It took her a long time to find her footing again." Margaret looked at Louise with new understanding. "You never told me how hard it was after Frank died. You always seemed so together." Louise smiled sadly. "I was good at pretending. But inside? I was a mess. For at least a year. Maybe longer." "How did you get through it?" "I didn't have a choice. Life keeps going whether you're ready or not. So eventually, I decided to go with it instead of fighting it." They talked for 2 hours. The coffee shop filled and emptied around them, but they stayed, 3 women spanning 2 generations, sharing stories about loss and survival and finding reasons to keep going. "The thing nobody tells you," Louise said, "is that grief doesn't have a timeline. People expect you to be better after a few months. They want you to move on, get back to normal. But it is not normal anymore. There's just learning to build a new life that doesn't include the person you lost." "How long did it take you?" Margaret asked. "I'm still learning," Louise said honestly. 5 years later, I'm still figuring it out. But it gets easier. Not better, necessarily. Just easier. The weight doesn't get lighter, but you get stronger carrying it." Jennifer nodded. "I remember visiting Mom that first year after Dad died. She'd forgotten to eat. The house was a mess. She'd wear the same clothes for days. I was so worried." "What changed?" Margaret asked. "One day," Louise said, "I realized I was disappearing. Not dying, exactly. Just fading. Becoming invisible. And I thought, Frank didn't love an invisible woman. He loved me. Loud, messy, complicated me. And I decided that if I was going to honor his memory, I needed to be me again. Not the same me, that person died when he did. But a new version. Someone who carried his love forward instead of being buried under his loss." Margaret felt those words settle into her bones. That was it, wasn't it? She'd been trying to go back to who she was before Robert died, but that woman was gone. The woman she was now had to be different, changed by loss but not defined by it. When Margaret got home that afternoon, there was a letter in her mailbox. Her heart raced when she saw Sarah's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single page, but it felt heavy with meaning. "Dear Mom," it read. "I got your letter this morning. I read it 3 times. Then I cried. Then I read it again. I want you to know something. You are not a burden. You never were. Even when you pushed me away, even when you didn't answer my calls, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped wanting you in my life. I just didn't know how to reach you. But you reached out. You called. You wrote. You showed up. And that's all I ever wanted. That's all any of us ever wanted. I love you, Mom. I love you so much. Let's not lose any more time. Let's make up for the months we missed. Let's be in each other's lives again, really in them. I'll call you tonight." Answer the phone. "Love, Sarah." Margaret held the letter to her chest and wept. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope finally finding its footing. That evening, the phone rang at 7 o'clock. Margaret picked up on the first ring. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "Hi, Mom." And they talked. Really talked. For over an hour. About everything and nothing. Making plans for Sarah's birthday. Discussing Thanksgiving, just 2 months away. Sharing recipes and memories and hopes for the future. When they hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet house, and the silence felt different. Not empty. Just peaceful. Over the next week, responses to her letters arrived one by one. David called after getting his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to apologize, Mom. But thank you? For being honest. For letting me in. Robert's brother Jim wrote back a long letter of his own, sharing memories of Robert as a boy, stories Margaret had never heard. "He loved you so much," Jim wrote. "And he'd want you to be happy. He'd want you to live, not just exist." Louise didn't write back. She showed up at Margaret's door instead, with a casserole and a photo album. "I thought we could go through old pictures," she said. "Remember the good times. All four of us together." They spent the afternoon looking at photos, vacations to the beach, holiday dinners, graduations, and birthdays. Frank and Robert standing side by side, arms around each other's shoulders. Louise and Margaret are younger, laughing at some long-forgotten joke. "We had good lives, didn't we?" Louise said softly. "We did," Margaret agreed. "We really did." One letter didn't get a response, the one to her old friend Barbara, who'd moved to Arizona 5 years ago. Margaret felt a pang of loss, wondering if she'd waited too long with that friendship. But then, 2 weeks later, her phone rang at an unusual hour. "Margaret? It's Barbara. I'm so sorry it took me so long to call. I've been dealing with some health issues. But I got your letter, and it meant the world to me. I thought I was the only one feeling lost and forgotten out here." They talked for an hour, catching up on 5 years of distance. Barbara was lonely too, struggling with her own losses and changes. By the end of the call, they'd made plans. Margaret would visit in the spring. A real visit, a week or two, exploring Arizona together like they used to explore their hometown. As Sarah's birthday approached, Margaret felt nervous in a way she hadn't expected. The tradition had been so important for so many years. What if she called at 3:14 a.m. and Sarah was annoyed? What if the magic was gone, the tradition spoiled by 6 months of distance? But Sarah had said she wanted the call. She'd said she missed it. The night before Sarah's birthday, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed watching the clock. At 2 a.m., she gave up and went to the kitchen. She made tea and sat at the table, Robert's chair empty across from her. "I wish you were here," she said to the empty chair. "You'd know what to say. You always knew what to say." But Robert wasn't there. And Margaret was learning that was okay. She could miss him and still move forward. She could honor his memory and still build a new life. The two things weren't mutually exclusive. At 3:10 a.m., she picked up the phone. Her hands were shaking. She dialed Sarah's number and waited. At exactly 3:14, Sarah answered on the first ring. "Mom. Happy birthday, sweetheart. 43 years ago, at this exact moment, you came into the world. And my life was never the same." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. "You called." "Of course I called. I'll always call. Every year, for as long as I can. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby." They talked for 20 minutes, Margaret sharing memories of Sarah's birth, Sarah sharing how much the tradition meant to her, and both of them crying and laughing in equal measure. When Margaret hung up, the house felt less empty. The silence felt less heavy. She went back to bed and slept until 9, waking to sunshine streaming through the windows. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt excited about something. Sarah and David had coordinated. Both families would come to her house, like they used to. It would be crowded and chaotic and exactly what Margaret needed. She spent the week preparing. Not just cooking, but really preparing. She cleaned guest rooms. She bought new towels. She planned a menu with everyone's favorites: David's green bean casserole, Sarah's sweet potato pie, and Robert's mother's stuffing recipe that Margaret had perfected over the years. Carol helped her move furniture to make room for everyone. Stan helped her set up extra tables in the dining room. Louise came over to help cook, and they worked side by side in the kitchen, talking and laughing like old times. "It's good to have you back," Louise said while peeling potatoes. "It's good to be back," Margaret replied. And she meant it. The night before Thanksgiving, Margaret stood in her kitchen looking at all the prep work. Pies cooling on the counter, ingredients organized, tables set. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't in months. Tomorrow it would be filled with noise and laughter and life. She walked through the rooms, touching things Robert had touched. his favorite chair, the bookshelf he built, the photographs he'd hung. He was gone, but he was also everywhere. In the house they'd built together, in the children they'd raised, in the life they'd created. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. Margaret woke early, as she always did on holidays. She put the turkey in the oven and started on side dishes, moving through the familiar routines with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah's family arrived first, at 11. Emma and her younger brother rushed in with hugs and excited chatter. Sarah followed, carrying pies, her face lighting up when she saw her mother. "Mom, the house looks beautiful." "I had help," Margaret said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I'm learning I don't have to do everything alone." David's family arrived an hour later, and suddenly the house was full of voices and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family. Margaret moved through it all, hugging her grandchildren, talking with her children, and feeling more present than she had in months. During dinner, with everyone gathered around the extended table, Sarah raised her glass. "I want to make a toast," she said. "To Mom. For bringing us all together. For showing us that it's never too late to come back to the people who love you." "To Grandma," the grandchildren echoed. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "To my family," she said. "And to second chances." After dinner, while the kids played outside and the adults lingered over pie, David came to sit beside Margaret on the couch. "Dad would be happy," he said quietly. "Seeing you like this. Seeing all of us together." "I think so too," Margaret said. "I think he'd also give me grief for taking so long to figure things out." David laughed. "Probably. But then he'd hug you and tell you he was proud of you anyway. That's what he always did." After everyone left, dishes washed, leftovers divided, hugs exchanged, Margaret stood in her quiet house again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the peaceful quiet after a good day, filled with the echoes of laughter and love. She went to the bedroom and pulled out the box of Robert's things she'd been slowly sorting through. At the bottom was his journal, something she'd found but hadn't been able to open until now. She sat on the bed and opened it carefully. His handwriting filled the pages, thoughts, memories, and observations. She flipped through slowly, reading random entries. And then she found one dated 3 days before he died. Her breath caught. "Margaret and I took a walk today," it read. "She held my hand the whole time, even though my hands shake now. She pretended not to notice. That's love, not the big gestures, but the small pretending. The gentle overlooking of what time has done to us. If I go before her, and I probably will, the women in her family live forever. I hope she knows she gave me a beautiful life. I hope she doesn't spend too long being sad. I hope she laughs again. I hope she lives. That's all I want for her. To live." Margaret closed the journal and held it to her chest, crying quietly. Robert had known. Even at the end, he'd been thinking about her, hoping she'd be okay. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I'm trying to live, Robert. It's hard, but I'm trying." December came with its own challenges. The first Christmas without Robert loomed large. Margaret had always loved Christmas, the decorating, the baking, and the traditions. But this year, she wasn't sure she could face it. Sarah called in early December. "Mom, what do you want to do for Christmas? We can come to you, or you can come to us, or we can do something completely different." "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Everything feels different now." "Then let's make new traditions," Sarah said. "We can honor Dad and still celebrate. They're not mutually exclusive." So they planned something different. Christmas at Sarah's house instead of Margaret's. A different menu. Different traditions. Still family, but acknowledging that things had changed. Margaret spent Christmas Eve at her own house, quiet and reflective. She hung one ornament on a small tree, a handmade one from Sarah's childhood, made of clay and glitter and love. She looked through photo albums. She lit a candle for Robert. And then, on Christmas morning, she drove to Sarah's house and celebrated with her family. It was different. Harder in some ways. But also good. New memories layered over old ones. In January, Margaret did something she'd been thinking about for weeks. She went to a grief support group at the community center. Walking in was one of the hardest things she'd ever done, admitting she needed help and sitting in a circle with strangers who shared her pain. But by the end of that first meeting, she felt less alone. These people understood. They knew about the silence, the empty chairs, and the traditions that hurt now. They knew about learning to live again while still carrying love for someone gone. Spring came slowly, but it came. Margaret started volunteering at the library, something she'd always meant to do. She helped organize books and ran a reading program for children. The kids called her Mrs. Margaret and hugged her when they saw her. She and Louise started a tradition of Sunday morning walks. They'd meet at the park, walk for an hour, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they talked about Frank and Robert. Sometimes they didn't. But they showed up for each other, week after week. Margaret invited Carol and Stan over for dinner once a month. She accepted invitations instead of declining them. She called her children not just when there was news, but just to talk. She became a regular presence in her grandchildren's lives, attending soccer games and piano recitals, babysitting when needed, and being there. The phone on the wall started ringing again. Not every day, but regularly. Sarah checking in during her lunch break. David is calling on his drive home from work. Louise confirming their Sunday walk. Barbara from Arizona with updates about her health and plans for Margaret's spring visit. Each ring was a reminder that Margaret had found her way back. Not to the life she'd had before, that life was gone, buried with Robert. But to a new life, one built on the foundation of the old but shaped differently. Quieter in some ways, fuller in others. One afternoon in March, Margaret was in the garden, Robert's garden, really, though she was learning to make it hers too. She was planting tulip bulbs, something Robert had always done in the fall. But Margaret was doing it her way, in the spring, choosing colors Robert never would have picked. Bright pinks and deep purples instead of his practical reds and yellows. Her hands were in the dirt when she heard a car pull up. She looked up to see Sarah's car in the driveway, and her daughter getting out with Emma. "Surprise visit?" Margaret said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "We were in the neighborhood," Sarah said, though Margaret knew they weren't. They'd driven 40 minutes to get here. Emma wanted to see Grandma. Emma ran up and hugged Margaret, not caring about the dirt. "Grandma, can you teach me to garden? Mom says you know everything about flowers." "I don't know everything," Margaret said, smiling. "But I know enough. Come on, I'll show you how to plant these bulbs." They spent the afternoon in the garden, 3 generations of women on their knees in the dirt. Margaret showed Emma how to dig the holes, how deep to plant, and how to cover the bulbs gently. "Will they really grow?" Emma asked, skeptical. "They will. Not right away. You have to be patient. But in a few weeks, you'll see green shoots coming up. And then, if you wait a little longer, you'll see flowers. That's a long time to wait." "The best things usually are," Margaret said. Sarah watched them, her eyes soft. When Emma ran inside to wash her hands, Sarah stayed behind with Margaret. "You seem good, Mom. Really good." "I am," Margaret said. "Most days. Some days are still hard. But I'm learning that's okay. That grief doesn't have an expiration date. I can miss your father and still enjoy planting flowers. Both things can be true." "When did you get so wise?" Sarah asked, smiling. "I'm not wise. I'm just old. And I've made enough mistakes to learn a few things." Sarah took her mother's dirty hand in hers. "I'm proud of you. For coming back to us. For not giving up." "I'm proud of me too," Margaret said, and she meant it. Not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd done something hard. She'd chosen life over grief. Connection over isolation. Hope over despair. In April, Margaret prepared for Barbara's visit. Her friend was flying in from Arizona for a week, and Margaret had been planning it for months. She'd cleaned out the guest room, the room that used to be David's. She'd bought new sheets and put fresh flowers on the nightstand. She'd made a list of all the places they'd go and things they'd do. The night before Barbara arrived, Margaret sat in the kitchen with the list in front of her. The botanical gardens. The museum. Their old favorite restaurant that somehow was still there after 40 years. The antique shops they used to browse on Saturday mornings. But she also wrote down simpler things. Long talks over coffee. Watching old movies on the couch. Walking around the neighborhood. Sitting on the porch and doing nothing at all. Because she'd learned something over the past year. The best moments weren't the planned ones. They were the quiet spaces in between. The conversations that happened while doing dishes. The laughter erupted over nothing in particular. The comfortable silence of being with someone who knew you, really knew you, and loved you anyway. Barbara's plane arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Margaret waited at the airport, more nervous than she'd expected. What if too much time had passed? What if they'd both changed too much? What if the friendship that had felt so essential 5 years ago felt hollow now? But then Barbara came through the gate, thinner than Margaret remembered, walking with a cane Margaret didn't know she needed. And when their eyes met, Barbara's face broke into a smile that erased every worry. Margaret. They hugged in the middle of the airport, two old women holding each other while travelers flowed around them like water around rocks. That week with Barbara was exactly what Margaret needed. They fell back into their old rhythm easily, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at private jokes, and sharing comfortable silence. But they also talked about the hard things. Barbara's health problems, diabetes, arthritis, and the heart condition that made her slow down. Her loneliness in Arizona, where she'd moved to be near her son but found herself isolated in a city where she knew no one. I thought being near family would be enough, Barbara said one night over tea. But David works all day. His wife is busy with her career. The grandkids have their own lives. I see them for Sunday dinners, and that's it. The rest of the week, I'm alone. Why don't you move back? Margaret asked. Where would I go? My house is sold. My friends have moved on. I can't just show up and expect things to be how they were. Can't you? Margaret said. I pushed everyone away for 6 months. And when I came back, they were still there. Not all of them, maybe. But the ones who mattered. You matter, Barbara. You always mattered. And if you came back, we'd make room for you. I'd make room for you. Barbara's eyes filled with tears. You mean that? I do. This house is too big for just me. The guest room is just sitting there. You could stay here while you figure things out. You could start over. We're too old to start over. Says who? Margaret challenged. Who made that rule? I started over at 72. You can start over at 73. Barbara didn't commit, not that night. But Margaret could see the idea taking root, the way a seed takes root in good soil. Maybe Barbara would move back. Maybe she wouldn't. But at least now she knew she had options. She knew someone wanted her. When Barbara flew back to Arizona, she promised to visit again soon. And to seriously consider Margaret's offer. They hugged at the airport, and this time, it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like see you soon. Mother's Day arrived in May. Margaret woke up to the phone ringing, Sarah calling to wish her happy Mother's Day. Then David. Then 3 of her grandchildren, each talking over each other to tell her they loved her. At noon, both her children showed up with their families. They'd coordinated without telling her, a surprise Mother's Day lunch. They brought food and set up in Margaret's backyard. Everyone crowded around the picnic table under the oak tree. David stood up to give a toast. To Mom. For being the strongest person I know. For showing us what resilience looks like. For coming back to us when it would have been easier to stay away. To Grandma, the grandchildren chorused. After lunch, Emma pulled Margaret aside. Grandma, remember those tulips we planted? Of course. Come see. Emma led her to the garden, and Margaret gasped. The bulbs had bloomed, bright purples and pinks, exactly as she'd planned. But more than that, in between the tulips were other flowers. Flowers Margaret hadn't planted. We helped, Emma said proudly. Grandpa's old garden had flowers growing on their own, and we transplanted some around your tulips. So it's both of yours. Grandpa's and yours. Together. Margaret knelt down, her arthritic knees protesting, and looked at the flowers through tears. Daisies that had self-seeded from Robert's original plantings. Forget-me-nots he'd loved. And her new tulips, bright and bold and different. It's perfect, she whispered. Summer brought changes. Barbara called in June to say she'd made a decision. She was moving back. She'd be here by August. Could Margaret really handle having a roommate at their age? I think, Margaret said, that having a roommate sounds perfect. They spent the summer preparing. Margaret cleared out more space in the guest room, making it truly Barbara's. Sarah helped her move furniture and add personal touches. David built shelves for Barbara's books. Louise was thrilled. It'll be like old times, she said. The three of us together again. We can start a weekly dinner tradition. Book club. Whatever we want. We're starting a retirement home, Margaret joked. We're starting a life, Louise corrected. That's what we're doing. In July, Margaret celebrated what would have been her and Robert's 50th wedding anniversary. She'd been dreading the day for months, knowing it would be hard. Sarah offered to stay with her, but Margaret declined. I need to do this alone, she said. Just me and my memories. She spent the day looking through photo albums, their wedding, young and hopeful. Their first apartment, barely furnished. The kids as babies. Family vacations. Ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious. She made Robert's favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots. She set the table for two, even though she'd be eating alone. She lit candles. She played their wedding song on the old record player that still worked, somehow, after 50 years. And she talked to him. Out loud, in her quiet house, she talked. 50 years, she said. We were supposed to celebrate together. You were supposed to be here. I'm angry at you for leaving, even though I know you didn't have a choice. I'm angry at myself for wasting 6 months hiding from life. But mostly, I'm grateful. For every year, every day, every ordinary moment we had together. She raised her glass, his favorite whiskey, something she never drank but kept in the cabinet. To us, she said. To the life we built. To the love that doesn't end just because you did. To carry you forward while still moving forward myself. She drank, wincing at the burn, and laughed through her tears. I don't know how you drank this stuff. After dinner, she went outside and sat in the garden. The summer evening was warm, with fireflies just beginning to emerge. She could hear neighbors in their yards and children playing somewhere down the street. Life continued, as it always did. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, lost, isolated, drowning in grief. That woman felt like a stranger now. Not because the grief was gone. It wasn't. She still missed Robert every day. Still reached for the phone to call him before remembering he wouldn't answer. Still woke up sometimes expecting to see him beside her. But she'd learned to carry the grief differently. Not as a weight that pinned her down, but as something she could carry while still walking forward. The grief was part of her now, woven into who she'd become. But it wasn't all of her. She pulled out her phone, a concession to modernity that Sarah had insisted on, and texted her daughter. Thank you for not giving up on me. Sarah's response came immediately. Never. I love you, Mom. Margaret smiled and put the phone away. She sat in the garden as the sun set, as the fireflies multiplied, as the day that she dreaded came to an end. And she was okay. Not happy exactly, but okay. And okay was enough. Barbara arrived on a hot August afternoon, moving truck trailing behind her son's car. Margaret stood on the porch watching them unload, remembering the last time she'd watched someone move into this house, herself and Robert, 49 years ago, young and excited and terrified. I can't believe I'm doing this, Barbara said, hugging Margaret on the porch. I can't believe it took you this long, Margaret replied. They spent the week settling Barbara in, turning the guest room into a real bedroom. Barbara's books filled the news shelves. Her photographs covered the dresser. Her clothes filled the closet. The house that had felt too empty suddenly felt full again. At first, they were cautious around each other, Too polite, too careful. Margaret worried she'd made a mistake. Maybe they were too old to live together. Maybe 5 years apart had changed them too much. But gradually, they found their rhythm. Barbara was an early riser, Margaret wasn't. Barbara liked the house cool, Margaret preferred it warm. They compromised, adjusted, and learned each other's habits and quirks. And slowly, the house became theirs. Not Robert and Margaret's. Not Barbara's and her late husband's. But something new. A home built on friendship and shared history, and the understanding that neither of them wanted to be alone anymore. Louise came over for their first official dinner in September. The three of them, widows all, survivors all, sat at Margaret's kitchen table and laughed like they had 40 years ago. Different now, older, marked by loss. But still there. Still showing up for each other. "We should do this every week," Louise said. "Every week," Barbara agreed. "Every week," Margaret confirmed. And they did. Fall arrived with its familiar beauty, leaves turning, air cooling, and that particular quality of light that made everything look softer. Margaret and Barbara settled into routines. Morning coffee together. Shared cooking duties. Evening TV or reading, each in their own space but comfortably aware of the other's presence. Margaret continued her library volunteering. Barbara joined her. They helped children pick out books and listen to them read, two old women finding purpose in the smallest moments. Sarah visited often, sometimes with the whole family, sometimes alone. She and Margaret would sit on the porch and talk, really talk, the way they used to before grief built walls between them. "You seem happy, Mom," Sarah said one October afternoon. "I am," Margaret said, and realized it was true. "Not all the time. I still have hard days. But more good days than bad now. Dad would be happy about that." "I think so too. I think he'd also have some choice words about how long it took me to figure things out." Sarah laughed. "He definitely would." On what would have been Robert's 74th birthday, Margaret did something new. Instead of spending the day in sadness, she threw a party. Not a birthday party exactly, more of a celebration of life. She invited Robert's brother Jim and his family. Their old neighbors who still lived nearby. Friends from church. People who'd known and loved Robert. They gathered in Margaret's backyard, sharing stories and memories. Laughing at Robert's terrible jokes. Remembering his kindness, his stubbornness, and his unwavering love for his family. "He would have hated this," Jim said, smiling. "All these people are making a fuss over him." "He would have loved it," Margaret corrected. "He would have pretended to hate it but secretly loved every minute." November came, and with it, the 1-year anniversary of Robert's death. Margaret had been dreading it, marking it on her calendar with a mixture of anticipation and fear. But when the day arrived, it wasn't as devastating as she'd expected. She woke up sad, yes. She cried, yes. But she also got up. She made coffee. She called her children. She went to the cemetery and left flowers, daisies and forget-me-nots from the garden, his flowers and hers together. She sat by his grave and talked to him, updating him on everything he'd missed. "Barbara's living with me now. You'd like that. She keeps me from getting too stuck in my own head. Sarah's doing well, Emma made the honor roll. David got that promotion. The grandkids are growing up so fast." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm okay, Robert. It took me a while. I made mistakes. But I'm okay now. I miss you every day. But I'm living. Like you wanted me to. Like you deserved for me to. I'm living." That evening, Sarah and David came over. Barbara made dinner, Robert's favorite pot roast recipe. They ate together, sharing memories, some sad, some happy. They looked at photos. They cried and laughed in equal measure. "To Dad," David said, raising his glass. "Who taught us how to love." To Robert, Barbara added. "Who loved well." To my husband, Margaret said quietly. "Who gave me the life I needed and the strength to continue it without him." They clinked glasses, and in that moment, Margaret felt something shift. Not the grief leaving, it would never fully leave. But the weight of it is redistributing. becoming something she could carry without it consuming her. That night, after everyone left, Margaret stood in her kitchen looking at the avocado-green phone on the wall. It had witnessed so much, joy and sorrow, good news and bad, connections made and lost. For months, its silence had felt like punishment. But now it rang regularly. Evidence of life, of relationships maintained, of people who cared. She thought about that day, almost a year ago, when she'd stood in this same spot feeling suffocated by silence. When the phone hadn't rung in 3 days and she'd realized how alone she'd become. That day had been a turning point, though she hadn't known it yet. That day had been the beginning of her coming back. The call that never came, the one she'd been waiting for without realizing it, wasn't from Robert. He couldn't call anymore. The call she'd been waiting for was from herself. A wake-up call. A reminder that life was still happening and she could either participate or watch from the sidelines. She'd chosen to participate. Finally, eventually, messily. But she'd chosen it. Barbara came into the kitchen, wrapped in her bathrobe. Couldn't sleep? Just thinking, Margaret said. About Robert? About everything. About how close I came to losing everything that mattered because I was too scared and sad to hold on to it. Barbara put her arm around Margaret's shoulders. But you didn't lose it. That's what matters. You found your way back. With help, Margaret said. I couldn't have done it alone. Nobody does anything alone, Barbara said. That's the secret nobody tells you when you're young. You think you have to be strong, independent, and self-sufficient. But real strength is knowing when to ask for help. Knowing when to let people in. Thanksgiving arrived again, the second one without Robert, but the first one where Margaret didn't dread it. She and Barbara cooked together. A seamless partnership developed over months of shared meals. Sarah and David arrived with their families. Louise came with her daughter Jennifer, visiting from Portland again. The house was full of people, of noise, of life. Margaret moved through it all feeling present and grateful. This was what Robert had wanted for her. Not to forget him, but to keep living. To fill the house with family and friends. To find joy again. During dinner, Emma asked a question that made everyone pause. Grandma, do you still miss Grandpa? The table went quiet. Sarah started to intervene, to redirect, but Margaret shook her head. I do, Margaret said honestly. Every single day. But missing him doesn't mean I can't be happy. Both things can be true at the same time. I can miss him and still enjoy this dinner. I can wish he was here and still be grateful for all of you who are here. Is that why you have 2 gardens now? Emma asked. Grandpa's garden and your garden? Exactly, Margaret said. I keep his garden because I want to remember him. But I planted my own garden because I need to keep growing too. We can honor the past and still build a future. David reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. When did you get so wise, Mom? When I stopped being stubborn, Margaret said, smiling. When I let people help me. When I realized that asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage. After dinner, while the kids played outside and the adults lingered over pie, Sarah pulled Margaret aside. I want to tell you something, Sarah said. This past year, watching you come back to us, watching you rebuild your life, it's taught me something important. What's that? That it's never too late. To change, to grow, to reach out. You could have stayed closed off. You could have let grief consume you. But you didn't. You fought your way back. And that took more strength than anything I've ever seen. Margaret hugged her daughter, feeling tears on both their faces. I almost didn't fight back. I almost gave up. If you and David hadn't kept reaching out, if Louise hadn't stayed patient, if Barbara hadn't needed me, I might have stayed lost. But you didn't, Sarah said firmly. That's what matters. You didn't give up. December brought Christmas preparations. Margaret and Barbara decorated the house together, mixing Robert's old ornaments with new ones Barbara had brought from Arizona. They created new traditions while honoring old ones. On Christmas Eve, Margaret invited everyone to her house, both her children's families, Louise and Jennifer, Barbara's son and his family, who drove up from Arizona, and Carol and Stan from across the street. The house was packed, every chair filled, people sitting on the floor, and kids running through the rooms. It was chaos. It was beautiful. At one point, Margaret stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, watching it all. The tree lights twinkling. The fire in the fireplace. Her family and friends gathered, talking and laughing. Barbara is helping in the kitchen. Louise playing cards with the grandchildren. Sarah and David are deep in conversation. This was life. Messy, complicated, imperfect life. And it was good. That night, after everyone left, Barbara and Margaret sat in the living room with the tree lights on and the fire burning low. "Thank you," Barbara said quietly. "For giving me a place to land. For letting me start over." "Thank you," Margaret replied. "For reminding me that I don't have to do everything alone. That sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you need help." They sat in comfortable silence, two old friends who'd found each other again, who'd built something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. New Year's Eve arrived, and with it, a moment of reflection. Margaret thought about the year that had passed, the lowest point of her life, followed by the slow, painful, beautiful climb back. She thought about the woman she'd been on that Tuesday in November when the phone hadn't rung for 3 days. That woman had been drowning. That woman had been sure she'd lost everything that mattered. That woman had been wrong. Margaret hadn't lost everything. She'd lost Robert, yes. That loss was real and permanent and still hurt. But she hadn't lost her children, though she'd come close. She hadn't lost her friends, though she tried to push them away. She hadn't lost herself, though for a while she'd disappeared. She'd found her way back. Slowly, messily, with help from people who refused to give up on her. She'd written letters in the middle of the night. She'd made phone calls that terrified her. She'd accepted invitations when isolation felt safer. She'd been honest about her pain instead of hiding it. She'd asked for help instead of pretending she was fine. And now, a year later, her life looked different. Not better than before Robert died, different. Quieter in some ways. Fuller in others. Built on new foundations while honoring old memories. At midnight, Barbara popped a bottle of champagne. They'd stayed home, too old and tired for New Year's parties. They toasted in Margaret's living room, just the two of them. To new beginnings, Barbara said. To second chances, Margaret added. To friendship, they said together. January and February passed in their quiet rhythm. Margaret continued volunteering at the library. She and Barbara hosted their weekly dinners with Louise. She talked to her children regularly, visited her grandchildren, and maintained the connections she'd fought so hard to rebuild. In March, she received a letter. Not an email, not a text, but a real letter with a handwritten envelope. The return address was from someone named Patricia Chin, a name Margaret didn't recognize. Inside was a single page. Dear Mrs. Margaret, it read. You don't know me, but I've been visiting your library for 6 months now with my grandson. You helped him pick out his first chapter book. You listened to him read even when he stumbled over words. You smiled at him like he was special. And he is special. He's on the autism spectrum and struggles with new situations. But you made him feel comfortable. You made him feel seen. I wanted to thank you for that. You're changing lives, even if you don't realize it. Sincerely, Patricia Chin. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She thought she was just volunteering to fill time, to have something to do. She hadn't realized she mattered to anyone. But she mattered. In small ways, quiet ways. The way Robert had mattered to her. The way her children mattered. The way all of us matter to each other in the ordinary moments of living. She put the letter in a drawer in the kitchen, the same drawer where she kept Sarah's letters, David's cards, and Barbara's notes. Evidence of connection. Proof that showing up mattered. Spring came again, the second spring since Robert's death. Margaret and Barbara worked in the garden together, expanding it. More tulips. Some roses. A vegetable patch Barbara wanted to try. Emma came over one Saturday to help. Remember last year? She said. When we planted tulips, I asked if they'd really grow. I remember. You were right. They grew. And now we're planting more. That's how it works, Margaret said. You plant something, you wait, and you trust. And eventually, something beautiful grows. In April, on a random Tuesday afternoon, Margaret was in the kitchen making tea when the phone rang. She answered without thinking. Mrs. Johnson? This is Karen Mills. I'm the new activities director at Sunrise Senior Center. Your friend Louise Chapman suggested I call you. We're starting a grief support group, and Louise thought you might be interested in co-facilitating it. She said you've been through something that might help others who are struggling. Margaret's first instinct was to decline. To say she wasn't qualified, that she couldn't help anyone, that she was still figuring things out herself. But then she thought about that version of herself from a year and a half ago. The woman standing in this kitchen, suffocated by silence, was convinced no one cared. What would she have needed to hear? What would have helped her? I'd like that, Margaret heard herself say. I'd like to help if I can. The group started in May. 8 people gathered in a circle at the senior center, widows and widowers, all at different stages of grief. Some recently bereaved, raw and shattered. Some years into their loss, still figuring out how to live. Margaret shared her story. Not the pretty version, but the real one. The isolation. The mistakes. The months she wasted pushing people away. The hard work of coming back. The ongoing struggle of carrying loss while still living. It doesn't get easier, she told them honestly. But you get stronger. The grief doesn't get smaller. You just grow bigger around it. You learn to hold it without letting it hold you. A woman named Janet, whose husband had died 3 months earlier, started crying. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be alone. You don't have to know, Margaret said gently. You just have to show up. For yourself, for the people who love you, for this group. Show up even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. After the meeting, Janet approached Margaret. Thank you for being honest. Everyone keeps telling me it'll get better, and I don't believe them. But you didn't say that. You said it stays hard, but I'll get stronger. That feels true. It is true, Margaret said. And you will get stronger. I promise. Summer brought another milestone, Margaret's 73rd birthday. Sarah and David planned a party, but Margaret had one request. Not just family, she said. I want everyone. Everyone who helped me come back. So they gathered in Margaret's backyard, her children and grandchildren, Barbara, Louise and Jennifer, Carol and Stan, Robert's brother Jim, people from the library, and members of her grief support group. 40 people, maybe more, filling her yard with life and laughter. Emma gave a speech she'd written herself. My grandma is the bravest person I know, she read from a card covered in her careful handwriting. Last year, she was very sad. But she didn't stay sad. She chose to be happy again. She chose to be here with us. And I'm so glad she did, because I love her so much. Margaret cried, of course. But they were good tears. Grateful tears. That evening, after everyone left, Sarah stayed behind to help clean up. Mom, she said while washing dishes, do you remember that morning you called me? Almost 2 years ago now? Right after Dad died, and you called at 6:53 in the morning? I remember. That call changed everything. I'd been so worried about you. And then you called, and you were honest. You told me you were lonely and scared. You stopped pretending. And that's when I knew you'd be okay. Not right away, but eventually. I almost didn't call, Margaret admitted. I almost convinced myself it was too early, that you'd be annoyed, and that I should handle things alone. I'm so glad you didn't, Sarah said. I'm so glad you called. Because that's when you started coming back to us. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, mother and daughter working side by side the way they had for decades. Fall arrived again, and with it, a letter from Patricia Chin, the woman who'd written months ago. My grandson asks about you every week, she wrote. When can we see Mrs. Margaret at the library? You've become one of his favorite people. Thank you for seeing him when so many people just see his diagnosis. Margaret wrote back, inviting them to a special story time she and Barbara had started hosting. They came, and watching that little boy's face light up when he saw her made Margaret understand something profound. She thought, for a long time after Robert died, that her purpose was gone. That without him, without the role of wife, she was diminished. Less than. Without meaning. But she'd been wrong. Her purpose hadn't died with Robert. It had changed. Evolved. She was still a mother, a grandmother, and a friend. She was also a volunteer, a grief group facilitator, and a neighbor who showed up with casseroles and company. She was someone who mattered to a little boy with autism. Someone who made tea for her roommate. Someone who called her children not because she needed them, but because she loved them. That was the purpose. Not grand or dramatic. Just showing up, day after day, for the people around her. In October, the grief support group had grown to 15 people. Margaret and Louise co-facilitated, 2 widows helping others navigate the path they'd walked. One evening, a man named Thomas shared his story. "My wife died a year ago," he said. "And I feel like I'm supposed to be over it by now. People keep saying, you must be feeling better, like grief has an expiration date. But I'm not better. I'm just different." "That's exactly right," Margaret said. "You're different. The person you were before died with your wife. But the person you're becoming can still have a good life. It won't be the same. But it can still be good." November came again, the 2nd anniversary of Robert's death. Margaret woke up that morning without the dread she'd felt last year. She missed Robert, yes. But the missing felt different now. Less like drowning, more like a dull ache she'd learned to live with. She went to the cemetery early, before anyone else. She brought flowers from the garden, his forget-me-nots and her tulips, grown together now, impossible to separate. 2 years, she said to his grave. I made it 2 years. Some days I wasn't sure I would. But I did. With a lot of help, a lot of mistakes, and a lot of tears. But I did. She sat on the bench nearby and watched the morning light filter through the trees. I hope you're proud of me, Robert. I hope you see what I've built since you left. It's not the life we planned. But it's a life. A good one. And I'm living it. Like you wanted? Like you deserved for me to. That evening, her family gathered at her house. It had become a tradition, though no one had officially declared it. On the anniversary of Robert's death, they came together. Not to wallow in sadness, but to remember. To celebrate the life he'd lived. To acknowledge the space he'd left while also celebrating how they'd grown around it. They shared their favorite Robert stories. David remembered how his father taught him to change a tire in a grocery store parking lot when he was 16. Sarah remembered Robert's terrible singing voice and how he'd sing anyway, loudly, embarrassingly, and joyfully. Emma, who'd only known him for a few years before he died, remembered how he'd let her help in the garden, even though she mostly just made messes. He was patient, Emma said. He never got mad when I accidentally stepped on the flowers. He was patient with all of us, Margaret said softly. Even when we didn't deserve it. Especially then. Barbara, who'd only met Robert a few times before he died, shared her own memory. I remember the last time I saw him. He pulled me aside and said, "Take care of Margaret for me. She'll say she doesn't need anyone, but she does. Make her remember that." I didn't understand then what he meant. But I do now. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He knew. Even at the end, he knew I'd struggle with asking for help. He knew you, Sarah said simply. And he loved you enough to worry about what would happen after. They ate dinner together, Robert's favorite foods, and it felt less like mourning and more like honoring. This was how you kept someone alive, not by staying frozen in grief, but by carrying them forward into your continuing life. By telling their stories. By passing down their wisdom. By becoming, in small ways, the best parts of who they were. After everyone left, Margaret sat alone in her living room. But Barbara was upstairs. Sarah was a phone call away. David would text tomorrow to check in. Louise will come by this weekend. The grief support group will meet next Tuesday. She wasn't alone. And more importantly, she didn't want to be alone anymore. That was the real change, not that the loneliness had disappeared, but that she'd stopped accepting it as inevitable. She'd stopped believing she deserved isolation. She'd started believing she deserved connection, love, and presence. December arrived with its familiar blend of joy and melancholy. Margaret's second Christmas without Robert. But this year, she was ready for it. She and Barbara decorated the house together, stringing lights and hanging ornaments. They baked cookies for neighbors. They attended the church's Christmas Eve service with Louise. On Christmas morning, Margaret's house was full again. But this year, she'd also invited people who had nowhere else to go. Janet from the grief support group, whose children lived across the country. Thomas, whose family had stopped inviting him after his wife died because his grief made them uncomfortable. Patricia Chin and her grandson, who lit up when he saw Margaret. It was an unconventional Christmas, a mixture of family and friends and strangers who'd become family. But it was perfect in its imperfection. It was life, messy, complicated, beautiful life. Emma helped Margaret serve dinner, carefully carrying plates like she'd been given an important responsibility. "Grandma," she whispered, "there are a lot of people here." "There are," Margaret agreed. "Do you know all of them?" "Some of them. Others I'm just getting to know. But that's okay. That's what makes it interesting." After dinner, while everyone gathered in the living room, Margaret stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the avocado-green phone on the wall. 2 years ago, its silence had nearly broken her. Now it rang regularly. Sarah's daily check-ins, David's weekend calls, Louise confirming plans, and Barbara's son calling to chat with his mother. But more than that, Margaret had learned she didn't need to wait for the phone to ring. She could pick it up. She could call someone. She could reach out. Connection was a two-way street, and she'd spent too much of her life waiting on the other side, hoping someone would cross to her. Now she crossed too. She met people halfway. Sometimes she crossed the whole distance. New Year's Eve arrived, and this time, Margaret hosted a small gathering. Barbara, Louise and Jennifer, Carol and Stan, and Sarah and David with their spouses. The grandchildren were at friends' houses, celebrating in their own way. As midnight approached, they gathered in the living room with glasses of champagne. Louise raised her glass first. To the year behind us. To survival. To friendship. To second chances. To Margaret, Barbara added, who taught us all that it's never too late to come back. To all of us, Margaret said. For showing up. For each other, for ourselves. For choosing life even when it would be easier not to. They clinked glasses and drank as the clock struck midnight. Outside, fireworks erupted, neighbors celebrating, the world continuing its endless cycle of endings and beginnings. After everyone left, Margaret and Barbara sat in the quiet house, the Christmas tree lights still twinkling. "It's been a good year," Barbara said. "It has," Margaret agreed. "Not an easy year. But a good one." "Do you think it gets easier? Being without them?" Margaret considered the question. Robert had been gone for 2 years and 3 months. Some days it felt like yesterday. Some days it felt like forever. "I think," she said carefully, "that easier isn't the right word. I think we get better at carrying it. The weight is still there, but we build stronger muscles." "That's a good way to put it," Barbara said. "I like that." They sat in comfortable silence, two old women who'd found each other again, who'd built a life together from the pieces of their separate losses. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. But it was the life they had. And it was enough. Spring came again, the third spring since Robert's death. Margaret stood in the garden, planning the year's planting. The original garden, Robert's garden, was still there, maintained and honored. But her section had grown. What had started as a few tulips had expanded into a full garden bed. Roses and daisies, vegetables and herbs. A butterfly garden that Emma had helped design. "The garden's getting bigger every year," Barbara observed, joining her outside. "It is," Margaret said. "I think that's how it should be. We keep what was, but we add to it. We grow around the original foundation." That afternoon, Margaret received a call from the senior center. They wanted her to lead a workshop on rebuilding after loss. She'd be speaking to a group of newly widowed people, sharing her story, and offering hope. Margaret's first instinct was still, after all this time, to say no. To say she wasn't qualified, that she was still figuring things out, that someone else would be better. But then she thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago. If that woman, lost, isolated, drowning, could see this version of Margaret, what would she think? She'd think anything was possible. She'd think change was achievable. She'd think hope was real. "I'll do it," Margaret said. The workshop was scheduled for April. Margaret spent weeks preparing, writing down her story, and organizing her thoughts. But when the day came and she stood in front of 30 people, men and women, all recently bereaved, all struggling, she set aside her notes. "I'm going to tell you the truth," she said. "And the truth is, this is hard. What you're going through is one of the hardest things a person can experience. I'm not going to tell you it gets easier, because that's not always true. But I will tell you this, you get stronger. You learn to carry it. And if you let them, people will help you." She told them about the phone that didn't ring. About pushing people away. About the night she wrote letters at 3 a.m. because she couldn't bear the silence anymore. About calling Sarah at 6:53 in the morning and being honest for the first time in months. About accepting Carol's invitation to dinner even though it terrified her. "The call that saved me," Margaret said, "wasn't from anyone else. It was the call I made to my daughter. It was me picking up the phone and admitting I needed help. That was the call that changed everything." After the workshop, people lined up to talk to her. A woman named Rose, whose husband had died 6 weeks earlier, grabbed Margaret's hand. "Thank you. Everyone keeps telling me to be strong, to move forward, to get over it. But you said it's okay that it's hard. You gave me permission to struggle." "It is okay," Margaret assured her. "Struggle isn't failure. It's part of the process. Just don't struggle alone. That's the key. Don't isolate yourself the way I did." A man named William, probably in his 80s, waited until everyone else had left. "I lost my wife 8 months ago," he said. "And I think I've been doing exactly what you described. Pushing people away. Waiting for them to fix it. But nobody can fix it, can they?" "No," Margaret said gently. "Nobody can fix it. But people can help you carry it. If you let them." "How do I start? How do I reach out after months of pushing everyone away?" Margaret thought about her letters, her phone calls, and her hesitant steps back into the world. You start small. One phone call. One letter. One honest conversation. You don't have to fix everything at once. You just have to start. William nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for being honest. For showing that it's possible." After the workshop, Margaret sat in her car for a moment before driving home. She thought about how far she'd come. From the woman standing in her kitchen, suffocated by silence, to this, someone who could help others navigate the same darkness she'd survived. She thought about Robert, about what he'd say if he could see her now. He'd probably make a joke about her being a public speaker, about how the woman who'd been too shy to give a toast at their wedding was now leading workshops. But underneath the joke, he'd be proud. She knew he would. When she got home, Barbara was in the kitchen making dinner. The house smelled like garlic and herbs, warm and welcoming. "How'd it go?" Barbara asked. "Good," Margaret said. "Really good. I think I actually helped some people." "Of course you did. You've been helping people all along. You just finally realized it." They ate dinner together, talking about their days. Barbara's garden club meeting. Margaret's workshop. The ordinary, beautiful minutiae of shared life. After dinner, the phone rang. Margaret answered to hear Emma's voice, excited and breathless. "Grandma! I got the lead in the school play. I'm going to be Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. When is it?" 3 weeks. "Will you come?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world." After they hung up, Margaret marked the date on her calendar. Another event to attend. Another way to show up for the people she loved. She looked around her kitchen, The same kitchen where she'd stood 3 years ago, feeling like her life was over. The same avocado-green phone. The same table where she'd written those desperate letters in the middle of the night. But everything was different. She was different. Not healed, grief didn't work that way. But whole in a different way. Scarred but functional. Changed but growing. That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done in a while. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Robert. "Dear Robert," she began. "It's been 3 years since you left. 3 years of learning to live without you. I won't lie and say it's been easy. You know me better than that. I struggled. I made mistakes. I pushed people away and almost lost everything that mattered. But I found my way back. With help from our children, from Barbara, from Louise, and from so many people who refused to give up on me. I found my way back to myself. To a new version of myself, one that carries you with me but isn't consumed by losing you. I'm doing things now that would surprise you. Leading workshops. Helping people through grief. Growing a garden that's bigger than the one you started. Living with a roommate at 73 years old. Making new friends. Building a life I never imagined. It's not the life we planned. We were supposed to grow old together, remember? We were supposed to have decades more. But life doesn't always follow the plan. And I've learned, slowly, painfully, that an unplanned life can still be a good life. I miss you. Every single day. I miss your terrible jokes and your patient explanations and the way you'd hum while you worked in the garden. I miss watching TV with you and arguing about what to have for dinner and the sound of your footsteps in our house. But I'm okay. That's what I want you to know. I'm okay. Not because I've moved on or forgotten you, I'll never forget you. But because I learned to carry the love and the loss together. Because I learned that grief doesn't have to be the end of joy. Because I learned that showing up, even when it's hard, is the bravest thing we can do. Thank you for 47 years. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for the life we built together. And thank you for giving me the strength, even though you didn't mean to build a new life without you. I love you. I'll always love you. But I'm living. Like you wanted. Like you deserved for me to. I'm living. Love, Margaret. She folded the letter and put it in the box with all the others. Letters from Robert, letters from her children, and letters from friends. The accumulated evidence of a life well lived, of connections maintained, of love given and received. May arrived with its particular beauty, flowers blooming, birds singing, and that sense of renewal that spring always brought. Margaret spent more time in the garden now, finding peace in the ritual of planting and tending. Barbara often joined her, and they'd work side by side, comfortable in their companionship. One afternoon, while they were weeding the vegetable patch, Barbara said, "I never thanked you properly. For letting me move in. For giving me a second chance at life." "You don't need to thank me," Margaret said. "You gave me as much as I gave you. Maybe more." "How do you figure?" "You reminded me that I didn't have to do everything alone. That accepting help isn't weakness. That sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you need someone." Barbara smiled. "We saved each other then." "I think we did." Emma's play arrived in late May. Margaret sat in the audience with Sarah and David, watching her granddaughter shine on stage. Emma sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow with a clarity that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Afterward, Emma ran up to her, still in costume. "Did you like it, Grandma?" "I loved it," Margaret said, hugging her tight. "You were magnificent." "I was scared," Emma admitted. "But you told me once that the bravest thing is showing up even when you're scared." "So I did." Margaret's heart swelled. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. That's exactly right." In early June, Margaret visited the cemetery. Not because it was an anniversary or special occasion, but just because she wanted to. She brought fresh flowers from the garden and sat on the bench near Robert's grave. "I led another workshop last week," she told him. 25 people this time. One woman came up to me afterward and said I'd given her hope. Can you imagine? Me, giving someone hope. The woman who spent 6 months hiding from the world. I've been thinking a lot about hope lately. About what it means. I used to think hope was about things getting better, about returning to how they were. But that's not hope, that's denial. Real hope is believing you can build something new from the broken pieces. Real hope is believing that even though everything changed, life can still be good. I have that hope now. It took me 3 years to find it, but I have it. And I want other people to have it too. So I keep showing up. I keep telling my story. I keep letting people know that if I can do it, stubborn, scared, isolated me, anyone can do it. The cemetery was peaceful, with birds singing in the trees and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Margaret sat for a long time, not sad exactly, just reflective. I should go, she finally said. Barbara and I are hosting dinner tonight. Louise is coming, and so are Carol and Stan. We do it every week now, rotate houses, share meals, and stay connected. It's become the best part of my week. I'll come back soon. I always do. But I'm not coming back because I'm stuck in the past. I'm coming back because you're part of my story, and I want to honor that. But you're not the whole story anymore. There's more. There's so much more. And I think you'd be happy about that. October came again, bringing Sarah's birthday. Margaret prepared for her 3:14 a.m. call with a sense of tradition and joy rather than duty. This was their thing. It had been for 44 years now. Nothing, not even death, would stop it. At exactly 3:14, Margaret dialed. Sarah answered on the first ring. Happy birthday, my beautiful girl. 44 years ago, at this exact moment, you made me a mother. And you still call every year, Sarah said, her voice warm with love. Even the year I thought you might forget. I'll never forget, Margaret promised. This is sacred time. You and me. No matter what. They talked for half an hour, as they always did. About the year that had passed, about plans for the future, about nothing and everything. When they finally hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen feeling grateful. The phone was silent now, at 3:45 in the morning. But it would ring later. It rang every day now, evidence of life, of connection, of relationships maintained and treasured. Margaret thought about the call that never came, that mythical call she'd been waiting for without realizing it. She thought she was waiting for someone to reach out, to save her, to fix her loneliness. But the call that changed everything was the one she made. The call to Sarah at 6:53 a.m. The calls to her friends. The calls asking for help, admitting weakness, and choosing connection over isolation. The call that never came taught Margaret the most important lesson of her life. You can't wait for rescue. You have to save yourself. But saving yourself doesn't mean doing it alone. It means having the courage to ask for help. To reach out. To show up. To admit you're struggling and accept that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. 3 years after Robert's death, Margaret's life was full. Not the same life, never the same. But a good life. A life built on honesty and connection and the daily choice to engage rather than withdraw. She had her children, her grandchildren, and her friends. She had Barbara, her unexpected roommate and companion. She had her grief support group, where she helped others navigate what she'd survived. She had her garden, growing bigger every year. She had purpose, meaning, and connection. She still missed Robert. She'd miss him until her own final day. But the missing no longer consumed her. It was part of her now, woven into the fabric of who she'd become. She was Margaret, widow, mother, grandmother, friend, survivor. All of it together, inseparable, whole in her complexity. As dawn broke over her quiet neighborhood, Margaret made coffee and sat at her kitchen table. The avocado-green phone hung on the wall, ready to ring with the day's connections. The garden outside her window waited to be tended. Barbara would wake soon, and they'd have breakfast together. Louise would call to confirm their afternoon walk. Sarah would text later with updates about the grandchildren. Life would continue, as it always did. And Margaret would be there for it. Present. Engaged. Alive. Because that was the final truth she'd learned. The call that never came was the call she'd been waiting to receive. But the call that saved her was the call she had the courage to make. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do, the most life-affirming, hope-filled, powerful thing, is to pick up the phone and ask for help. To reach out instead of withdrawing. To choose connection over isolation. To show up for life, even when life has broken us. The phone might not always ring, but we can always pick it up and dial. And that choice, the choice to reach out, to connect, to try, is what separates mere survival from truly living. In the quiet of your own life, remember, it's never too late to reach out. It's never too late to come back. It's never too late to choose connection over isolation, hope over despair, and life over mere existence. The call you're waiting for might be the one you need to make yourself.